The boulder had been there since Tuesday. It was a 17-ton piece of Precambrian granite, dark gray, angular, and roughly the size of a large automobile, sitting in the embankment along County Road 14 inches, Fillmore County, Nebraska, for as long as anyone could remember. It had always been there, visible from the road, partially buried in the slope, not doing anything in particular. The old-timer said it had been there before the road was paved, before the road was graded, before there was a road at all. Just one piece of glacial drift that had rearranged the Nebraska landscape 12,000 years ago and left rocks in inconvenient places. What that boulder had not done in anyone's memory was move. But on Tuesday morning, after 2 weeks of heavy rain, the embankment beneath it softened, shifted, and dropped 17 tons of granite directly across the westbound lane of County Road 14 at exactly the point that happened to be the only direct route between 3 farms and the grain elevator in Shickley. The farms could still get to town by going 12 miles out of the way on the state highway, but the school bus used County Road 14, the feed delivery truck used County Road 14, the propane company used County Road 14, so the county had to move the boulder. The county highway department called Midwest Construction out of Grand Island. Midwest Construction had the equipment for this kind of job, or at least it thought it did. They sent a Manitowoc 4,100 hydraulic crane, 2 years old, rated for 60 tons of lift capacity, along with a crew of 4 and a lead engineer named Dennis Pratt, a man who had managed extraction jobs on bridge projects and pipeline work all over the Central States and had never met a problem he could not solve with enough horsepower and the right rigging. Dennis arrived at the site on Wednesday morning. He walked around the boulder, took measurements, checked his rigging calculations, and set up the crane with what he described to his crew as a textbook outrigger configuration. The ground looked solid. The survey had indicated stable soil to a depth of 4 feet. The boulder was large, yes, but manageable. They would have it cleared by noon and be back in Grand Island by 4. But by noon on Wednesday, the boulder had not moved. The rigging had slipped twice on the smooth granite surface, forcing the crew to reset the slings and try different attachment points. By 5 o'clock Wednesday evening, they finally had the rigging set to Dennis's satisfaction and the crane positioned. The lift, they decided, would happen first thing Thursday morning. Then Thursday morning came, and Dennis found the problem. The crane's rear outrigger pads, the 4 stabilizing feet meant to spread the machine's weight and reaction force during a lift, had sunk overnight, not dramatically, not catastrophically, but enough. The ground under the rear pads had given way during the night as water kept moving through the saturated subsoil. The pads had dropped 18 inches. The crane was no longer level, and a crane that is not level cannot make a precision lift safely. Dennis Pratt was not a man who made unsafe lifts, so he called the county highway superintendent, Gerald Ferris, and explained the situation. They had 2 choices: either wait for the ground to stabilize, which could take a week with the wet weather still continuing, or bring in additional equipment to shore up the pads and reposition the crane before attempting the lift. He was already talking to his company about sending a second, smaller crane from Lincoln to help with the repositioning. Gerald Ferris thanked him, hung up, and stood there at the road closure looking at the boulder that was not moving and the crane that was not moving, and then thinking about the school bus that had been detoured since Tuesday, the propane truck with a delivery overdue at the Kellner farm, and the fact that his department's budget had already absorbed the cost of road closure signs and flaggers and was now about to absorb the cost of a second crane from Lincoln. That was when Elmer Hatch pulled up in his truck. But before I tell you about Elmer Hatch and his 1924 Case steam traction engine, you need to understand what that machine actually was, because calling it an old tractor would be like calling a locomotive an old bicycle. They belong to the same general category, yes, but not to the same nature. The Case steam traction engine was the workhorse of American agriculture from roughly 1880 to 1930. At its peak, the Case Steam Works in Racine, Wisconsin, was producing engines that farmers used for threshing, sawmilling, road grading, and any heavy pulling task that went beyond what horses could do. These machines were enormous. Boiler, firebox, flywheel, drive gearing, massive rear wheels built for traction. And they were heavy in a way modern equipment is not, because weight was not something to be minimized. Weight was the entire point. Weight meant traction. Weight meant the machine stayed planted when it was pulling something that did not want to move. Elmer's 1924 case was a 20-horsepower engine, modest by the standards of its own era, when the biggest machines could produce 80 horsepower or more, but it weighed 18 tons fully fired and watered. 18 tons of cast iron and boiler steel spread across drive wheels that were 5 feet in diameter and 20 inches wide. Those wheels were designed to spread the machine's weight across as much ground surface as possible, so it could move through soft fields without sinking. The boiler ran at 140 pounds per square inch working pressure, not much by modern standards, but enough to drive a 2-cylinder engine through the flywheel and bull gear down to the drive axle at a speed that produced roughly 4 miles per hour at the rear wheel rim and enough drawbar pull to move anything the cable in. Rigging could hold. The pullback force at the drawbar, the actual pulling strength of the machine, was not rated in tons the way modern equipment was rated. It was limited by the cable, the rigging, and the ground under the drive wheels. On hard ground, with good cable, a 20-horsepower case could pull well beyond its own weight. On soft ground where the wheels could spin, everything came down to throttle, angle, and patience. Elmer had been managing all three for 41 years. And that last characteristic, those wide wheels built for soft ground, was exactly what Dennis Pratt's modern crane did not have. The Manitowoc 4100 was a precision lifting machine designed for stable prepared surfaces, concrete pads, compacted gravel, engineered ground. Its outrigger pads were designed to concentrate force on a small area. That works very well when the ground is solid. It works very badly when it is not. The steam engine's drive wheels were built on the opposite principle. They were made for unstable ground. They were made for Nebraska in the spring, when fields were wet, soil was soft, horses were sinking to their hocks. And the steam engine kept moving because it spread its 18 tons across 10 square feet of wheel contact instead of 4 square feet of outrigger pad. Elmer Hatch understood that difference. He had understood it since 1948, when his father Clarence showed him how to read soft ground before driving onto it, how to test the surface with a fence post before committing the machine's weight, how to spread your pull across the engine's full drawbar capacity instead of jerking at the load. Clarence had learned it from his own father. And his father had learned it from the case dealer in Hebron, the man who sold the engine new in 1924 and then spent 2 years teaching farmers in the county how to use it. That meant 3 generations of knowledge about soft ground extraction were sitting in a machine shed west of Shickley, 63 years after the machine had been built, when Elmer heard about the stuck crane from Gerald Ferris at the co-op on Thursday morning. Gerald had stopped for coffee and was explaining the whole situation to whoever would listen. Elmer set down his cup and asked one question. "What's the ground like out there?" Gerald told him. 2 weeks of rain, saturated subsoil. The crane's pads had gone down 18 inches overnight. Elmer nodded slowly. "I'll come take a look," he said. "I might be able to help." Gerald looked at him. Elmer Hatch was 69 years old, lean, deliberate, the kind of farmer who had not hurried at anything since sometime in the 1970s. Gerald knew about the steam engine in Elmer's shed. Everybody in the county knew about it, the same way everybody knows about unusual things that have been around long enough to become part of the landscape. "You think that old machine could move it?" Gerald asked. Elmer picked up his coffee cup again. "I think it's worth looking at the ground," he said. So he drove out to the site. He walked around the boulder. He looked at the crane's sunken pads. He pressed his boot heel into the soil in several places, checking the consistency at depth. He studied the ground between the road surface and the embankment, reading the way the grass lay, the way the water had pooled and drained, the places where the soil carried a different sheen that told you what was happening 6 inches down. He spent about 15 minutes doing this without saying a word to anyone. Dennis Pratt watched him from beside the crane. Dennis was 45 years old, held a civil engineering degree from the University of Nebraska, and managed extraction projects for a living. He watched this old farmer press his boot heel into the ground and walk slow circles around the site, and he could feel the patience he usually controlled so well starting to wear thin. "Can I help you with something?" Dennis finally said. Elmer looked up. "I've got a 1924 case steam engine, 18 tons, 5-foot drive wheels. I think I can move that boulder and pull your crane out after if you want." Dennis stared at him for a second. Then he looked at the boulder, then back at Elmer. And then he laughed. Not a quiet laugh, not a polite laugh. It was the laugh of a man who had just heard something so far outside his frame of reference that he could not even find a respectful way to answer it. He turned to his crew and repeated what Elmer had said. "He's got a 1924 steam engine. Wants to move the boulder." The two crew members who heard him grinned. One of them shook his head. "Sir," Dennis said, pulling himself back under control, "I appreciate the offer, but we've got a second crane coming from Lincoln this afternoon. We're going to shore up the pads, reposition, and make the lift. We don't need—" He stopped, searching for the right word. "A steam engine." Elmer looked at the sunken pads. "Your second crane's going to have the same ground problem," he said. "This whole stretch is saturated 6 feet down. I can see it in the way the grass is lying." Dennis looked at the grass. He was not entirely sure what he was supposed to be seeing. "We'll use interlocking steel mats under the pads," he replied. "Standard, soft ground protocol." Elmer nodded. "All right," he said, and that was it. He did not argue. He did not push. He had said what he came to say. He walked back to his truck, climbed in, and drove home. He had his own work to do. The second crane arrived from Lincoln at 2:30 Thursday afternoon. It was a smaller machine, a Grove RT 890, rated at 80-ton capacity and built for rough terrain. The operator, Frank Wills, was experienced, efficient, and absolutely familiar with the kind of procedure they were now trying to execute. He and Dennis spent an hour laying interlocking steel mat panels under the proposed outrigger positions for the repositioned Manitowoc. Those mats had been designed for exactly this purpose, to spread the load across a larger surface area so the pads would not sink. At 4 o'clock, they began repositioning the primary crane. By 5:30, it was level, plumb, and the rigging had been reset on the boulder. By 6 o'clock, they were ready to make the lift. The Manitowoc's engine spooled up. The cables pulled tight. The rigging transferred force into the granite. Dennis watched the load indicators. The crane was working at 70% of rated capacity, comfortably inside safe limits. On paper, the boulder should have moved. It moved 3 inches. Then the steel mat panels under the rear outriggers began to tilt as the ground beneath them compressed unevenly. The load shifted. Dennis called off the lift immediately. He had been doing this long enough to know exactly what that tilt meant. The mats were spreading the load, yes, but the soil underneath them was still moving. The ground was simply not stable enough for a suspended lift of that weight. So there he stood at 6:15 in the evening on a county road in Nebraska with a 17-ton boulder, one stuck crane, and a second crane that had failed to reposition the first one, and he had to decide what came next. Gerald Ferris, who had been watching from his truck, walked over and stood beside him without saying anything. Dennis took off his hard hat. "I'm going to have to call the office," he said. Gerald nodded, then asked the question Dennis had not wanted to hear. "You want me to call Elmer Hatch?" Dennis went quiet. He had been doing this job for 17 years. In all that time, he had never been outperformed by a 63-year-old steam engine. But really, that was not the truth of the moment. The truth was simpler than that and much harder to avoid. He had never stood on a county road at 6:15 in the evening with 2 cranes and an unmoved boulder either. And Dennis Pratt, to his credit, was practical enough to understand that the situation he was in remained the situation he was in, no matter how he felt about it. "Call him," Dennis said. Elmer arrived at 7 the next morning. He had spent the previous evening preparing. Firing the boiler took time, so he had started the fire at 5:30, so the engine would be at working pressure when he needed it. Then he drove it down County Road 14 at 4 miles per hour, the maximum road speed of the machine, with his neighbor Harold Weiss following in a truck carrying the rigging equipment and a length of 3-inch steel cable Elmer had bought from a salvage yard in Hebron in 1971 and had never once needed to replace. The steam engine did not arrive quietly. A working steam traction engine creates its own acoustic world. The chuff of the exhaust valve, the hiss of pressure release, the deep vibration of the flywheel spinning at 250 RPM, and under all of it, that low, steady sound of the boiler doing its work, a kind of organized pressure you feel in your chest before you truly hear it with your ears. The 2 crane operators and the 3 crew members already on site had never stood this close to a working steam engine before. They stopped what they were doing and watched. Dennis Pratt watched too. He had been on site since 6, checking the ground one more time, looking for some configuration his modern equipment might still be able to use. He had found none. So now he stood beside his crane and watched Elmer Hatch drive an 18-ton steam engine, built when Calvin Coolidge was in the White House, down a Nebraska County road toward a job that 2 modern cranes had failed to finish. There was nothing useful to say. Elmer stopped the engine 40 feet from the boulder. He climbed down from the operator's platform, carefully and deliberately, because the platform stood 6 feet above the ground and Elmer was 69 years old. Then he walked to the boulder. He circled it the same way he had 2 days earlier, slowly, studying the rock, the ground, and the relationship between the two. Harold Weiss waited by the truck. After 10 minutes, Elmer returned to Harold. The 2 men spoke briefly, low enough that no one else could hear. Harold nodded and went back to the truck for the rigging. What Elmer had seen in that 10-minute inspection was not complicated, but it was specific. The boulder was no longer resting on stable ground. It had shifted off the embankment and come to rest on the saturated subsoil at the road margin. That meant its effective weight was being distributed across a relatively small contact area. The ground was soft, yes, but the real problem was not that the boulder was too heavy to move. The real problem was that every attempt to lift it had applied force at the top, which made the load rotate and caused the rigging to slip. The boulder did not need to be lifted, it needed to be rolled. And rolling required a completely different attachment point, a completely different pull angle, and a completely different way of thinking about the problem. Elmer had been rolling rocks out of fields since he was 20 years old. He knew where to put the chain. He and Harold rigged the cable around the boulder's lower forward edge. Not across the top where the crane slings had been placed, but at the base, where force applied at the correct angle would rotate the rock forward onto its smallest face and then drag it. The rigging process took 45 minutes. Harold handled the cable while Elmer directed the work, and Dennis Pratt stood nearby watching without saying a word. And really, that silence mattered, because the rigging configuration Elmer was using was not one Dennis had ever seen before, but he had learned enough in the last 36 hours to keep his opinions to himself. When the rigging was finally set, Elmer climbed back up to the operator's platform. He checked the boiler pressure, 140 pounds per square inch, exactly where it needed to be. He checked the cable run from the drawbar to the boulder. Straight, clean, no kinks. Then he looked at the ground between the engine and the rock. Soft, yes, but the drive wheels were already sitting on it and had not sunk. The weight was spread correctly. Then he opened the throttle. The steam engine did not lurch. It did not jerk. It did not spin its wheels. It moved forward at the same 4 miles per hour it had been moving since it left the shed. The cable went tight. The force transferred through the drawbar, through the rigging, into the base of the rock. And that boulder, the one that had not moved in 36 hours, despite the efforts of 2 modern cranes, rolled. It rolled forward 18 inches onto its smallest face. Then Elmer repositioned the cable attachment, reset the pull angle, rolled it again, and over the next 90 minutes, in 4 separate increments, moving the rigging between each pull and repositioning the engine each time, Elmer moved the 17-ton granite boulder 14 feet off the road surface and onto the embankment shoulder, where the county could deal with it whenever it pleased. The road was clear. Dennis Pratt had watched from 30 feet away for the full 90 minutes. He had not spoken. At some point, his 2 crane operators had stepped over and stood beside him, and the 3 men watched the steam engine work in silence, the way people watch something that feels impossible and obvious at the same time. Because once you saw the rolling technique, once you saw the cable placement, the angle, the deliberate incremental repositioning, it was not mysterious at all. It was just knowledge. Knowledge that existed before hydraulic cranes were invented. Knowledge that had been necessary before hydraulic cranes were invented. Knowledge that had been sitting in a machine shed west of Shickley for 63 years, waiting for the one situation that required it. And when the boulder was finally clear, Elmer did not stop there. He repositioned the engine again, rigged the cable to the Manitowoc's rear outrigger frame, and pulled the stuck crane out of its hole. In 11 minutes, the crane rolled backward onto solid ground, its pads dragging soft Nebraska soil behind them. Elmer closed the throttle, climbed down from the platform, coiled the cable with Harold, and loaded it back into the truck. Then Dennis Pratt walked over. There was a silence between the 2 men. and it had weight. The weight of 36 hours. The weight of 2 failed cranes. The weight of 1 successful steam engine. And deeper than that, the weight of everything those facts suggested about the difference between what you know and what you only think you know. "What do I owe you?" Dennis asked. Elmer looked at the cleared road. "Nothing," he said. "Gerald called me. I came. That's how it works out here." Dennis stood there for a moment. He was not a man who found gratitude easy to express, especially in moments where gratitude required admitting he had been wrong. But he had been standing on that road for 2 days. He was tired, the road was open, and the old farmer in front of him had done in 90 minutes what he had failed to do in 36 hours. "I laughed at you," Dennis said, "when you offered. I shouldn't have done that." Elmer looked back at him. "You didn't know what the machine could do," he said. "Most people don't. I should have asked." Elmer reached into the engine's toolbox, picked up his work gloves, and slipped them into his jacket pocket. "Well," he said, "now you know." Then he climbed back onto the operator's platform, opened the throttle, and the steam engine moved down County Road 14 at 4 miles per hour toward home. Smoke lifting from the stack, the exhaust valve marking out its cadence, the flywheel turning at 250 RPM. Dennis Pratt stood there and watched it go. He watched until it disappeared around the curve, where the county road bent north toward Shickley. I want to tell you what this story is really about, because it's not about a steam engine, and it's not about a stuck crane. At its core, this story isn't even about a county road in Nebraska. It's about 2 different relationships with knowledge. Dennis Pratt knew what his equipment could do. He had the specifications, the ratings, the engineering calculations, and the professional certifications. He understood his machines completely within the frame of what they were designed to accomplish. That's no small thing. That's real expertise, earned through years of experience. But what Dennis did not know, what his frame of reference simply did not account for, was what Elmer Hatch's machine could do. Not because Elmer's machine was better, because, honestly, it wasn't. A 1924 steam traction engine is slower, less efficient, more labor-intensive, and more dangerous than a modern hydraulic crane in nearly every situation a modern crane was designed for. Dennis's Manitowoc would outperform Elmer's Case steam engine 9 out of 10 times on prepared ground. That's not even a close comparison. But the 10th situation, where soft, saturated ground and a boulder that needed to be rolled rather than lifted, where a problem required a specific combination of distributed weight and low-angle pulling force, that was the situation they were in. And in that situation, Elmer's machine wasn't just competitive, it was the only equipment on the site that could make it work. The moment Dennis laughed was the revealing one. Not because the laugh was cruel, it wasn't. Dennis wasn't a cruel man, but the laugh revealed the underlying assumption that newer, more expensive, more sophisticated was automatically better in every situation. That a $200,000 modern crane was inherently superior to a 63-year-old steam engine, and that any offer from the owner of that old machine was not worth taking seriously. That assumption cost Dennis 36 hours and a second crane from Lincoln. Elmer Hatch didn't keep his machine for sentimental reasons, although he wasn't without sentiment. He didn't keep it because he used it all the time. He used it maybe twice a year, for specific jobs on his farm, when its particular capabilities were just the right tool. He kept it because he understood that the knowledge embedded in it, the soft ground extraction technique, the rolling approach to boulder removal, the boiler management, the cable rigging, the incremental repositioning, was knowledge that no one else in the county had. It was knowledge that existed in the machine, and it existed in Elmer, and together, they could do something that 2 modern cranes couldn't. Elmer never advertised this. He never went to county board meetings to tell the highway department they should consult him before sending cranes onto soft ground. He was just a farmer with an old machine, and over time, that machine taught him what it could do, and when it was needed, it could do something that nothing else could. That was the entirety of his self-description, and it worked. The machine was still running. The knowledge was still there. Dennis Pratt learned something that day, not just about the steam engine, but about how knowledge can live in old machines. Not the knowledge in the operator's manual, not the knowledge that can be derived from engineering specifications, but the knowledge that only comes from working a machine season after season, learning its responses, its limits, its particular capabilities. It's knowledge that can't be transferred by documentation. It's knowledge that can only be passed through years of working the machine, learning what it can do in a specific landscape under specific conditions. That knowledge had been passed down through 3 generations in the Hatch family. Elmer had inherited it from his father, Clarence. Clarence had inherited it from his father, and it had all started with the case dealer in Hebron, who spent 2 years teaching farmers how to use their new steam engines in 1924. Elmer's steam engine still works. It hasn't moved another county road boulder since 1987. But it could. The knowledge is still there. Still accurate. Still waiting for the next situation where it's the only thing that works. Dale, Elmer's son, told a reporter from the county newspaper in 2006 that his father never talked much about the boulder job. It was just a thing that happened, he said. The way things do when you're 69 years old and have seen enough of the world to know exactly what a particular machine can do in a particular situation. Dale said Dad didn't think it was a big deal. He thought it was just a job that needed doing and he had the right equipment. The fact that everybody else thought it was impossible, that kind of confused him. He didn't understand why you'd laugh at an offer before you understood what was being offered. That's the thing Elmer Hatch could never quite explain to anyone's satisfaction, why you would close the door before you knew what was behind it. Why you'd assume that the old thing was the wrong thing before you understood what the old thing was. Dennis Pratt, for his part, submitted a revised site assessment report to the county after the job, and it included a section on soft ground extraction techniques and the specific conditions under which rolling was preferable to lifting for boulder removal. He didn't name anyone, but he cited his experience on County Road 14. His company eventually adopted a protocol that required soft ground consultation before crane deployment on road margin sites. It was, in its way, a document about how to not need a steam engine, but it was written by a man who had learned something from one. And that was not nothing. In fact, it may have saved his company from the same situation in other counties, in other states, on other saturated road margins where a boulder had shifted and a crane seemed like the obvious answer. But it was the wrong answer. The boulder is still sitting on the embankment shoulder of County Road 14. The county never got around to doing anything with it. It's just a rock, sitting there by the side of the road, the same rock it has always been. It's in roughly the same place it came to rest in the summer of 1987 when it blocked the road for 3 days until a 69-year-old farmer drove 18 tons of 1,924 iron down the county road at 4 miles per hour and did in 90 minutes.